this crowd, I'll have a kick telling you I met a guy not too long ago in New Richmond, which is a community just across the St. Croix River, not too far from the Twin Cities, and he was well into his 90s, and he told me, he said he was a Minnesota Vikings fan. And in Wisconsin, that's pretty unusual because most of us are Packer fans, but he's only a few miles from the Twin Cities in St. Croix County. It's not too far away. There are a lot of folks who are Twins fans over there, so didn't completely surprise me he was a Vikings fan, but the guy told me he's well into his 90s. He was beginning to plan so his family didn't have to worry about, you know, after he passed away, what he was going to do next, and so he told me, he said, I actually asked the Minnesota Vikings football club if they'd let a couple of players be pallbearers. And I said to this guy, wow, that's quite a fan, that's pretty amazing. And he said, yeah, I wanted the Vikings to let me down one last time. So, my mom's a Cubs fan, so you could apply that to Cubby fans as well, but I couldn't resist. So first off, thank you all for having me. I'm going to comment a number of things regarding Wisconsin, but really talking a couple key areas of things that we've done over the last 18 months dealing with, particularly with reading, which we want to spend a fair amount of time talking a little bit about educator effectiveness, both for teachers and some of the overview we're doing with principals as well, and then talk a fair amount about school and school district accountability, and then mix it in with a few other things. And I think timing-wise, you guys can give me the hook, but I think there's some time for some questions at the end if you'd like. To me, that's sometimes the most interesting part of a presentation is taking questions and hearing from folks. But I appreciate being here. I just took the train up late last night from New York. I was in New York where I'm at frequently for different things, but yesterday I was meeting with our bond rating agencies, which when you talked about liabilities, proud to say we're the only state in the country that's got a fully funded pension system for our state annuitants, which is always a good thing to say to bond rating agencies. But you know, for us it's interesting talking about comparisons, but one of the things I talked about yesterday in meeting with the three major national bond rating agencies was our next budget. And we talk about jobs, we talk about balancing the budget, but we talked about a skills gap, and particularly we talked about things we were looking to do to further improve and reform education in our state, and it fits in rather nicely obviously with today. The reason I tell you that, though, is even bond rating agencies were interested in that. You know, normally you think of that, it's all talking about OPEB and pension liabilities and debt levels and things of that nature, but even there, that was an interesting component because they also look at your economic standing, and as you saw and heard from this morning's presentation, where we're at not only state by state, but where we're at as a country, globally, will have an impact on where we compete economically. So I'm going to talk a lot about my interest in education reform, in part from a moral imperative. I have a vested interest. I have two sons, one who just graduated from Wauwatosa East High School, a public school just outside of Milwaukee, who's going to be in a few weeks a college freshman. The other son, Alex, who's going to be a senior this year at Wauwatosa East. Certainly they're at the latter end of their K-12 experience, but for my two nieces, Isabella, who's going in the third grade, and Eva, who's going to be just starting out as a kindergartner, for me and every other parent and uncle or aunt and grandparent in my state, there's certainly a moral imperative for each of those kids that we make sure they have access to world-class education. I mentioned a lot when I ran for governor, I guess these days I have to qualify that, when I ran the first time for governor in the 2010 election, not the, I told my kids someday when they have kids, I'll get to tell my grandparent or my grandkids I'm the only governor ever in American history elected twice in the same term, so I got to have a little fun with that. But looking at the moral imperative, certainly for every kid I mentioned when I was campaigning, to me it didn't matter what zip code you were from, didn't matter what your parents did for a living, what demographics or that. It was a moral imperative to make sure that every kid in our state and every kid in our country has access to a great education, right? But I also got to tell you, as governor, increasingly it's become an economic imperative. So when I talk to employers, and this is not just anecdotal, when we've conducted surveys of employers in our state, one of the biggest concerns they have is that they don't have enough skilled workers. And a lot of times people hear that and they assume it's just in advanced manufacturing. And there are huge gaps in advanced manufacturing. I don't have enough skilled welders and machinists, fabricators and others, but it's also true in IT, in informatics, in healthcare, in other areas in my state and other states around the country. And so it's a combination of not only things, and I won't get too far into depth into this because this would be a whole different presentation, but in our technical colleges, which are like community colleges in some states, are two-year programs. It's certainly when it comes to engineering or IT or healthcare degrees, it's our four-year, both public and private institutions. But increasingly, it's also a reaction to our K through 12 experience. And employers telling me, I've got young people who are applying for jobs who came out of public high schools, not just in urban areas in our state, but all across our state, who do not have the skilled level that's basic to take on an entry-level job. And that's just unacceptable. Now, the plus and the minus of that, I'm always an optimist. You got to be in a job like mine at a time like mine. You got to be an optimist. So instead of looking at it as a horrible challenge, I look at it as a great opportunity, because the upside of that, and I hear it from other governors who say they have gaps in skilled workers as well, that means there are employers who have open jobs. The challenge is they just don't have enough people with the skill set needed to fill those. And so our challenge is, in K through 12 and technical and four-year college and university experiences, is to make sure we do enough from an economic imperative to make sure there are people to fill those spots. So that's, again, a little bit what I want to talk about. Now, it's also interesting, I'm thinking tomorrow night, like a lot of you, I'll be watching the start of the Olympics, the opening ceremony, the opening and closing. Tonette and I always like to watch things like that. It's kind of inspirational, not only to be proud of the USA team, but to be a part of a global experience like that just kind of transcends political and economic and fiscal differences and so forth. But thinking about it, in our state, one of the challenges we took on 18 months ago relates directly to what you talked about in the report this morning. And that is thinking about the Olympics. I think for many states, including ours in Wisconsin, there's this misguided perception, a sense of denial, that if you're an Olympian and you're the one carrying the flag because you won a medal 4 or 8 years ago, that you're automatically going to win a gold medal come this Olympics. And then the analogy to that is, well, anybody who won a gold medal or bronze or silver medal 4 years ago isn't even in the hunt unless they spent the last 4 years stepping up their game, right? There's not an athlete that any of us follow out there who's just said, you know what, I'm doing all the same things I did 4 years ago. I didn't do any advancements. I didn't do any new techniques. I didn't do any new training. I'm just going to show up again. I'm going to perform just like I did in the last Olympics, and I'm going to get the gold. If they think that, they're a fool, because it's just not going to happen, right? I mean, you look at, I used to run track. You look at track. I mean, you're talking about just fractions of a second between somebody who's getting the gold and somebody who's not even making the finals. And in a really real way, I think that relates to what we're talking about with education. We looked last year when we came in at reading in particular, and we found that when we looked at fourth grade assessments on the NAEP scores, we looked back to 1994. Now, I know today's data talked earlier about 92, I believe, through 2011, but a similar parallel. We looked at 1994. That was our basis when we started our discussion last March. We brought together a group I call Read the Lead Task Force. We brought State Superintendent of Public Instruction. In our state, Tony Evers, Dr. Evers is an independently elected head of our education component. Independent, but historically probably more aligned with Democrats. Obviously, I'm a Republican. But yet we had a shared interest in trying to resolve this issue of reading, because we looked at the numbers and found in '94, Wisconsin, in fourth grade reading assessment, was second only to Maine. Maine was the only one above us. We were above everybody else. 2011, there were 15 other states ahead of us. And there was kind of this misguided perception, and I think it fits into what you saw with the data today about those states who have excelled over the last 18 or 19 years versus those that have just kind of sat there. Wisconsin's not at the bottom, but it was close in terms of that time frame, because a lot of times you look, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota compete for the top ACT scores, and we think just because some of our top achievers are performing well, that somehow that means everybody in our schools is performing well and that we're advancing well enough. Again, much like that person carrying the flag in at the Olympics, if I haven't done anything since the last games, I'm not in the game. I'm not competing for the gold, and we've got to change that. So we put together this Read the Lead initiative. In some ways it was patterned off of bits and pieces of, thankfully, as I looked at your top list, We looked at Florida, we looked at Massachusetts, we looked at others. Major pieces of that are reflected, and we spent about a year putting that together. And so we looked at, one of the interesting things, and you've heard this said before, but we repeated it time and time again in our schools when I sat down with teachers and educators, when I talked with parents, when I talked with business leaders, but the idea of honing in on reading in particular. Because I thought about it when my kids were that young, but you don't think about it as an overall strategy if you're not in education. But this whole concept of how important reading is at the early ages. I know it's overused, but the whole concept of up until, about third grade, you learn to read. And from that point on, you use your reading skills to do the rest of your learning out there. We knew that was reinforced last year when we looked at the several studies on this, but I think it was last April there was a study that came out that showed that kids that are not reading at or above third grade reading level by the time they leave are 4 times more likely not to graduate. And if you add poverty as a factor, they're 13 times, 13 times more likely not to graduate. Well, you can, for us at least, we said this isn't just a reading test issue. It's not just where we're aligned in terms of NAEP scores. More important, it explains in many of, particularly urban, but in other school districts, why we don't have enough kids staying in school, because they get in the 4th and 5th and 6th grade and they're so far behind, they get frustrated. Next thing you know, they're dropping out. That's a huge problem for us. That's a tremendous problem for us. Again, not only from that moral imperative, but also from an economic imperative, because there's no way those young people are ready to work in any of the jobs that are available in our society today, and that's just unacceptable at both the moral and the economic imperative. So we did a number of things. I've jotted down a few so I wouldn't forget, although I won't list them all. One of the things we did, and which we'll start in this school year, is we came up with a number of recommendations. We enacted on a number of them. There's still some more things that will happen in the subsequent legislative session starting in January in the next budget. But some big things we did. We identified a need for a universal screener. One of the things we found from our talking to elementary school educators was there was not enough data, particularly for kindergarten teachers, to know where kids were at when they came in. So we set money aside in our budget, and we're going to do this so that school districts, we've got 424. We didn't want to have a problem with some school districts being able to do it and others not being able to afford it. So statewide, we're going to provide screeners for all kids going into kindergarten and give them the information so those teachers going in know where their kids are at. The recommendation is, along with that, we're starting out this year with doing it entry level, but is through 1st through 3rd grade, continuing to do that to help make sure we know where every kid is at in terms of reading assessment and attainment. We think that's incredibly important. We looked at a couple other areas. We looked at greater requirements in terms of reading when it comes to our schools of education. One of the challenges, we did not have folks from the university system on the panel itself, but we invited them to come in a number of times. But it was interesting. A fair amount of the feedback we got from folks on our panel and others we listened to was there's not enough reading taught to people who are teachers. That we weren't putting in place a requirement in our schools of education that those coming out who are candidates to be teachers actually going in elementary school education knew how to teach reading, knew good reading techniques. And we thought if that's one of the most important subjects that we have, we should make sure everybody who comes out in our, at least out of our systems, who wants to teach in our schools, that comes out of our universities, we should make that a priority. That if that's the driver that affects all the other capacity to learn and to be able to take on other learning skills, we should make sure that we make that a priority even when it comes to the skills that we're providing for those who are seeking to be teachers in the state of Wisconsin and beyond. So we included that as well. Obvious things like greater parental outreach, and we'll touch on a second, even some things I've done personally and our cabinet's done. Again, pattern after other states. Some of the things we've done on the licensure requirements pattern what is done here in Massachusetts, where we tried to look at the success here in this state. Some of the things in terms of promotions, and I mean that in terms of marketing, not advancing from one grade to the next, come out of Florida, where there's a fair amount done to not just get parents and educators involved, but to get the state involved, to view it as a priority and to get buy-in for that. We've done as well. Certainly, we've looked at even things as simple as whether or not our schools should be looking at mandatory summer school for kids who are behind in reading and other ways to get them to be caught up on it, and even a public-private partnership, a P3 when it comes to providing additional financial assistance beyond just what the state and local governments provide, because we found from our philanthropic communities, and we had a representative on our panel, that there was great interest in tackling this, because the more data we point out, the more we saw the direct correlation between success, not just in elementary school, but all the way through, driven by reading, the more interest there was from business leaders and philanthropic interest to help us out. So we created a Read the Lead Development Council that allows us to take funds, and we're not just doing it community by community, we're doing it so that it's statewide, again, so you don't have gaps in the 424 school districts. We've looked at, again, funding the screeners and the changes in making our teacher licensure requirements more rigorous, again, in many ways patterned after the requirements and the standards here in the state of Massachusetts, which we found, at least through our research and our discussions, to be highly effective in terms of demanding a higher level, particularly when it comes to reading. Now, Read the Lead, part of it for us was leading by example, and so I mentioned it last January in my State of the State address. I started shortly thereafter, and I go about every other week. I mentor a third grader from Bruce Guadalupe School in Milwaukee, where I sit down with her in the library, and we do reading. We do, actually these days it's kind of cool. I said at one point I did not only a reading thing, but we did something on one of their computers, and the associate principal came in, and we were both turning our head, and if you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, you know, at the end when he's with his son, and their heads both turned the same way, I said I was just as interested in the computer program as she was, because our heads were both kind of moving along to it, but I found it to be very rewarding, not just for her, but for me, and then be hopefully something we're inspiring others to do in each of our respective communities. Our cabinet is doing the same thing. They're taking on kids in different schools around the state to be mentors on when it comes to reading. And then beyond just the personal touch, to draw more attention to it, we've tried to have each of our cabinets, each of our state agencies take on programs that would help them focus in on reading as well. So for example, in a very practical way, our Department of Children and Families, which one of their programs is called Young Star, where we have a rating system from 1 to 5 stars for all of our state subsidized child care, which again is a whole nother subject of giving more stars, the higher the quality, to try and drive people into providing higher quality child care. One of the components we wrote into that's not just safety and other early childhood development, it is enhancing the reading development and saying if you want more money from the state, one of the things you got to show is that your staff is providing and is taking training in how to provide early childhood development focus on reading skills, with the idea being that at least if we're going to be compensating a child care provider, providing assistance for that, we should then say in return, we want you to help us because this is a goal, this is a focus, this is a priority for us. We do it in other areas that are less as direct, but for example, even in the Department of Tourism, tourism is a big part of our state's economy. We literally have our secretary there. They've developed a program where they highlight tourism destinations for people, particularly during the summer, to go to that tie into literary greats and interests out there to try and drive more people to visiting spots, and then talking about with their kids about ways to read and be connected with that. So as there's time off in the summer, it's more incentive to do. And then one you'd find particularly interesting, in our Department of Corrections, we literally have a new program. We piloted at one of our institutions and are going to expand. It's targeted towards fathers, but eventually it'll be fathers and mothers depending on the institution. But where we have offenders with children, we teed up a program where we're having them read and record it, and then providing it through iPad or iPads and other opportunities for them to read books to then share with their children back in their homes and their communities. The idea trying to not only help in terms of the reading, but help draw more connections between the offender and their family. The interesting thing about it was when we kicked this off, the person who helped us do that was Miss America, who happens to be from Kenosha, Wisconsin. And a little known fact probably to most of us here, but her platform, if you will, wasn't world peace or anything like that. It was her father was incarcerated years ago when she was younger, federally prosecuted for, I think, a white-collar crime, but nonetheless was prosecuted. And so her platform is helping children of offenders ensure that they don't feel like they have to repeat what their father and mother did, and so she helped us initiate this, which obviously drew a lot of attention to it. So for us, reading was a key component. We understand if we want to be, in a few years when you do another study, we want to be at the top of the list of advancement. The best way for us to target that to begin with is certainly focusing on reading. Secondly, we talked a little bit about, oh, thanks, you got one on either side for me. See, just like my state, I occasionally have a little bit of a drought in the mouth, and so I've got it. Actually, I think it's more from the allergies of being in a lot of cornfields that aren't producing lately. But the second point is on educator effectiveness, and this is one where, again, much like our reading initiative, we began, in this case, it was led by Dr. Evers, our superintendent of public instruction, my office and others. You got a very diverse group of stakeholders involved. But we felt, again, not only for our teachers, but for our principals, so a full scale of educator effectiveness, we had to have an aggressive program. As we looked ahead to the third step I'm going to talk about with school and school district accountability, that we had an aggressive program of really measuring results. That if we were going to demand more progress when it came to education, you can't manage something you don't measure. And so, but we also knew you had to have a system that had an objective and a transparent process. So we spent a lot of time, a lot of effort on that. We have, just as we'll talk about with schools and school districts, a fair amount of time of certainly looking at both progress and attainment, because for us, you can't have one or the other. Certainly a teacher who takes kids in 8th grade who are reading at 5th grade level and moves them up to 7th grade is a tremendous teacher. There's a great amount of progress involved with that. But we also know we want attainment. As I was mentioning earlier to Paul and others, both on teachers and on schools, when we talked about this in our school district and school accountability stakeholders group we put together, everybody acknowledged that the school and the teacher that moves those kids up should be rewarded and acknowledged, and that was super, and that's a great sign of an excellent teacher and excellent school. But then I asked an interesting, provocative question. I said, if you had a school where kids went from 5th to 7th grade when they were in 8th grade, or you had a school that took all these kids who were reading at 8th grade level when they came into 8th grade and you just moved them up a year, which one's better? And they, everybody immediately jumped on the one with the progress. And I said, okay, which school would you send your kids to? And there was kind of this pause as people admitted they probably sent them to the school where everybody was reading at or above 8th grade level, and said what that reminded me, and it reminded the group we're talking about it, is you can't have, you got to have a focus on both. We want progress, but you can't say that progress alone is the goal, because the goal is to make sure that all of our kids are not just in reading, but in other areas, are at or above where we want, not just at proficient, but ideally advanced, because again, if you go back to this economic imperative, just because they make great progress doesn't cut it when they go out and try and get a job and they're not reading, or they don't have the math skills or whatever other capacity they need to get a job. We're doing them a disservice if we don't focus in on both. So we did that with our educator effectiveness. It's interesting because in the past we weren't able to connect student outcome with any way of rewarding or acknowledging our teaching profession, which I think is unfortunate, because in a way it doesn't allow us to put the kind of emphasis and focus behind so many of our folks who are great teachers, and to reward and acknowledge them. A good example, and it ties in a little bit to what was mentioned in the introduction, obviously I get a lot of attention for what happened in what we did last year, was called Act 10, and obviously a good chunk of that was focused on changes we made to collective bargaining. In our state, the only thing left for any public employee in collective bargaining is base salary, and even that's capped at the CPI. And obviously a fair part of it was fiscal, not only for the state, but for all of our local governments, our schools, our counties, our municipalities. And that allowed a lot of our schools to more than make up for changes in their budgetary situations, with changes in terms of now allowing for them to collect a portion of their pension contribution. In most cases, it's taking what was the employee and the employer match, and actually having the employee make the employer match and the employer making the employer match. In many schools, and certainly in the state government, it means making something close to a 12.6% contribution for health insurance premiums. And any of you who work outside of government know that that's still pretty generous. In our state, on average in the private sector, most private sector employees are paying 20 to 25% or more of their health insurance. And even on the fiscal side, we had other changes that go beyond just pension and healthcare contributions. Probably one of the most noted was that prior to our reforms, most of our school districts had to buy their health insurance from essentially just one company. When we changed that, our reforms ultimately allowed schools to bid that out, and that saved school districts tens of millions of dollars without even a plan design change. I mean, literally just bidding it out. So those things, other things that churned in terms of changes of work rules allowed for greater flexibility and savings there as well. But the interesting thing is that's what got the focus. It was the money that got the focus, and that was a big part of it. And it's why we don't have some of the fiscal problems that other states and other jurisdictions have right now, although we're obviously cautious about that. But the bigger issue is what it means in terms of personnel. And I'll give you a good example. A couple years ago, in May of 2010, there was a young woman, a brand new teacher in the Milwaukee public school system, who was named one of the outstanding new teachers of the year. Got a designation, was getting an award for that, and really pretty exciting. The kind of teacher you'd want not just in MPS, our largest urban district in Milwaukee, or in Wisconsin, one of the largest in the country, the kind of teacher ideally you'd want in any school, public or private, suburban, rural, you name it. About a week later, she got notice she was being laid off. So even back in 2010, long before I was the governor, there were cuts in public education. There was just no relief given in response to that. And so MPS at that time had to lay off a whole wave of teachers. And I tell this story to people outside education, and I always get these looks like, how could that be? How could you take someone who was named, just had been named as one of the best outstanding new teachers, and lay them off? Well, because under the system at that time, you're the last in, you're the first out. You're the last hired, you're the first fired. One of the things, and obviously in this room there may be disagreement on that, but one of the things I feel has been one of our most successful reforms that will open the door for tremendous opportunity, not just for our kids, but to reward great teachers and great educators in our state, is we don't have that anymore. Other than a handful of school districts that still have contracts in place, most of which will expire by the end of next school year, everybody else, every other school district as well as state and local governments, can hire based on merit. They can pay based on performance. That means in the end we can put the best and the brightest in our classroom, and we can pay them to stay there. We can pay them to expand there. You've seen, God bless you, you see the kind of innovations that are out there. It's interesting. We have 424 school districts, and it opens the door for years. And we've been proud, one of the areas where we have been a reformer, I think a lot of what I saw in the report was that we kind of, like those Olympians who don't do anything after the last Olympics, we were sitting on our laurels from the past. One of the areas we have done, and we're pretty well known on Wisconsin school choice. And we've had great opportunities there. We were the first, the longest school choice program in the country in terms of a pure voucher program. So we've had reform there. But for a lot of us who were involved with that, the reason it wasn't to advance school choice was to make sure that every kid possible had access to a great education. Just so happens that was the means by which making that happen. A lot of people confuse that into thinking that those of us who are school choice advocates somehow were wanting to take on the public school system or replace it. No, I just want to make sure every kid in my state has access to a great education. If they get at a private school because they're either low income or now we've made advancements so we include middle class families in the city of Milwaukee. We've lifted the arbitrary cap that was in there for years. We've expanded the opportunity at places like Racine and others. I said, that's great. But what's equally as great is what we did under Act 10 allows our traditional public schools to do more of the successful things that have made our choice and our charter and our virtual schools be successful. That's one of those great opportunities out there. That's something that I think you're only starting to see really the beginning of how much of an impact it can have on education, not only in the state of Wisconsin, but the impact it can have on education debates all across this country. Because for us, what I love in 424 of my school districts, it opens the door for them to be laboratories of innovation. And they're not all going to be the same. We just had a community not long ago, a suburb, far western portions of Waukesha County, which is a suburban county of Milwaukee, come out and talk at a place called Conomowoc, where they're going to reduce the number of teachers they have, but in return, offer dramatic increase. I think they're looking on average at about $14,000 increases in pay for the teachers they have left. And they're trying something completely different where they're using different scheduling, they're using different technology, and they're going to give a higher pay compensation to the teachers that are left, saying, we want to hone in on our best and our brightest and figure out a way to give them the tools and the technology to even be even greater. Now, I'm not saying here today to tell you that's the one model that's going to work in every district, in every part of the country, but I like the fact that now our school boards, our administrators, our principals have the freedom to propose those sorts of changes. And in some other school district, it might be slightly different. I remember hearing last year, I forget which conference it was, but Secretary Duncan talking about, and this was his words, not mine, but saying he'd rather pay a great, exceptional teacher $100,000 than two mediocre teachers $50,000. For us, this is not about penalizing public employees. In fact, quite the contrary. Long term, this has the potential to offer more pay and more compensation to teachers who excel, to educators who excel, because it gives greater flexibility. But along with that, which goes to my third point, is you've got to have greater accountability. Not on the micro level. Doesn't mean we micromanage. I think one of the problems at both the state level and certainly at the federal level is there's too much micromanagement of education and this one-size-fits-all, and you got to leap through all these challenges out there. But I also think the flip side of that is we can't, in the states and local governments, just can't complain about it and expect no accountability. We've got to have a way of saying, here, for parents, for educators, for teachers, for principals, for students, for business leaders, for employers, for everybody out there, the more transparent and accountability system we have, the better off, and then make it as flexible to get there as possible. Because every teacher, every school, every district, every state is going to be slightly different. There doesn't necessarily have to be a one-size-fits-all approach. So last July, we put together about 29 folks, a stakeholder group of everyone from teachers to principals to school board members to philanthropic leaders to employers to business leaders, you name it, lawmakers from both political parties. Dr. Evers and I worked, and we had not only public school, we had choice advocates, we had private schools, we had all folks together with our goal being of saying, anywhere we use public funds, be it in a traditional school, a charter school, it's part of a voucher that goes to a private school, a virtual school, anywhere where there's the public's involved, let's try and figure out a way, most importantly for parents, but for everybody else, a way of having a truly transparent and objective way to measure where our schools are at. And I look at No Child Left Behind, and whether it's President Bush or Senator Kennedy, I give a lot of credit for at least raising the debate about having standards. I got to tell you, as a guy who loves the 10th Amendment, I prefer to have the states on that, and Medicaid and a whole lot of other issues be the ones that determine that. But I applaud the folks, even though I see some flaws in the implementation and mechanics of it. I applaud them for at least upping the national debate about standards. Because as it's clear in the document you talked about earlier today, we're not cutting it when it comes to advances compared to other countries around the globe. And if we had, you look at those top 5 or so states, if we had all the rest of us advancing at the levels we had in the top 5, we'd be at the top of the world. We'd be at the top. So it is clear, not just on a school-by-school basis or even a state-by-state basis, but as a country, it's imperative for us to do more to hold ourselves accountable. And so we put in place this process, spent a lot of time talking about it. We're just in the first stages of implementing it. And there's going to be a little shock factor in our state. Thankfully, I'm not unaccustomed to that, so it's all right. But this time, it's actually one where we're doing it with a larger cross-section out there. But the reality is, for years in our state, a lot of people looked at Milwaukee and said, okay, that's where the problem is. It's true around the country. A lot of folks look at urban areas and say, okay, that's where the problem is. Not acknowledging or admitting, kind of that denial factor, that a lot of our suburban and urban school districts aren't cutting it either. And not even just by district, but even by school or classroom. And so for us, the more transparent, the more aggressive, and it's not just one. For us, it's a combination of both attainment and progress through a series of things. Part of what we're posting in our new rating system, grading system, if you will, is looking at school districts on everything, not just where they're at in certain testing levels, where they're at in terms of graduation rates, where they're at successful completion on AP exams, not just on AP classes, where they're at in terms of other factors, in terms of the number of kids who are free or reduced lunch programs. All those factors, the more information we give, the better. Now, a lot of times when people talk about accountability, they assume it's really a target towards kicking failing schools or school districts. My view is just the opposite. My view is if you don't measure things, you cannot manage them. And ultimately, the biggest thing we want to do is find out the schools that are truly successful, not the ones that the realtors say are successful, not the ones that promotions say are successful, but the school districts and the schools and the educators who are truly successful, in part so we can reward them, but most importantly district-wide so we can replicate that success. You can't replicate it if you don't know which ones are the best. You just can't do it. And for anywhere, you know, so many other places in life, you know, when you go buy a book, or buy a car, a lot of people read, you know, the blue book about it. You look at consumer reports, you look at details out there. You don't just say, well, I like that ad, or at least hopefully you don't. You try and look at comparables out there. That's what we're trying to do here. So for us in each of these areas, what we wanted to do was to be, you know, data-driven. A number of the things that we've done over the last 18 months, I was happy to see when seeing this report, come from places where, whether it's the student information system that we looked at, comparables in Florida or Delaware, whether it's looking at stepping up our teacher licensure component, looking at Massachusetts, whether it's looking at some of the other advances, we realized we weren't going to reinvent the wheel. We were going to look at places that were successful. Thankfully, the data that we've seen in the report you saw earlier today suggested the states we looked at were good states to look at considering their advancement. But the biggest, most important thing we had to do was admit there was a problem, to get out of denial, and to acknowledge that we were willing to take a little bit of a hit to tell people that may otherwise be surprised to know that not every school and every community is performing as well as they think. But in the end, we're doing them, and most importantly, their children, a disservice by not telling them that and by not doing something about it. And so that's why for me it was actually, at first I remember last week when I got access to the data, they were kind of apologetic saying, well, you know, Wisconsin's not the bottom, but they're near in terms of education, student advancement. And I said, no, actually it's helpful for two reasons. And I'll end with this and open up some questions. For us, in part, because it affirmed, you know, we looked at the numbers from 1992 to 2011. That's when I started. So one, I don't directly take blame for it other than living in the state at the time, but it's not something I've specifically done as being governor, so it's easier to look at it, but it affirmed why, particularly when I mentioned those reading scores, why we took the action we did over the last 18 months. In many ways, other than in the school choice moment, I think what we've done in the last 18 months in our state is probably more education reform than Wisconsin had done in the previous 18 years. But it took admitting that there was a problem and that we had to deal with it. And it wasn't just an urban problem focused on Milwaukee. It was a problem all across the state, and that we had to acknowledge that. But the good news is, again, as an optimist, is once you deal with that, once you acknowledge that, it gets you over the hurdle so you can actually start talking about real solutions, not just ways of glossing over or covering up, because, again, as I hear from employers, it's not cutting it. And so I just end with this, and I assume it's true in other states. I go back to those two core principles. For probably almost all of you, or one way or another, directly involved either through your careers or your interest in education. So I would think, I would assume from the teachers and educators I've known, many of whom, I should just say as an aside, at Wauwatosa East, where my kids went to school, I always get people ask me, how have your kids been over the last year and a half with all this? And I say, one of the great joys I have and an affirmation I have in the teaching profession is my kids, as much as I was targeted by all sorts of crazy, nasty things over the last 18 months, my kids could not have had a better experience with their principal, their teachers, and their fellow classmates at Wauwatosa East High School than I could ever imagine. What that affirmed to me is something I've tried to say doesn't always get covered, is that the teachers I know overwhelmingly love their kids. They got into the profession because they want kids to excel, they want them to do better, they love education for all the right reasons, that somewhere along the way, bureaucracies of all sorts of types have gotten in the way of many folks doing that. The more we can peel that back, the more flexibility and freedom we give for people who are in education for all the right reasons, the better off we are. So I think for all of you here, certainly trying to make those improvements, not just in my state, but in all the states of this country, is a moral imperative. But I would just add an explanation point and tell you, for all of us who are in positions where we also have to balance off economic interest and the challenges we have out here, it's not just equal. In many ways, it's a greater incentive to say it's not just a moral imperative, it's an economic imperative, state by state and certainly as a country, that we do more to attack these issues on, and we break down the denial that's out there to say we really need to take on real solutions to the real problems we face. And if we do, the positive, the optimist in me says there's no doubt we can do it. We've done it before in so many other areas, we can do it here, and that's why it's a pleasure to be with you here today. With that, I can take some questions. Sure, yeah, I can. Yeah.
So why don't you try to come to the mic if you have a question so that everybody in the room can hear it, because some of the acoustics in the room aren't perfect. So if anybody has a question, Rick Hanishek over here has a question, Governor.
Governor, I wanted to applaud you both recognizing the problem you've had and the actions you've taken. But one of the things we've seen in a number of districts and states is that the forces that like the current system wait you out.
Yeah.
And how confident are you that you've taken a path that will stick? Does the legislation sort of make it clear that it's going to follow on into the future, or what do you think is going to happen?
Well, I think really for us the next step, and we started it last July, we implemented a portion. In fact, last week our Department of Public Instruction started putting out some of the new components to this, which was the first ripple of shock waves. Because again, if you're living in a community where you've always been told your schools are great and some of the data is a little bit different, it's a shock wave out there. But I think the key is to see this follow through is continuing to put pressure and focus on a transparent and objective accountability system for both districts and schools as well. Because if you don't have that, that's ultimately what's going to force the change. Because Paul and I were talking about this before, 424 school districts, one of the great benefits of this is we're giving tremendous flexibility to people who are duly elected at the local level to be school board members, and the people they appoint as superintendents and then they hire as principals and others to take on some real exciting reform. But you're right, there's a lot of people, and for 8 years I was in county government, and there were always people who were trying to wait you out, thinking the next person would be a little bit more open towards the status quo that they embraced. And so there's always that concern there. Giving people flexibility means sometimes there may not be enough willpower at that local level to do it, but I think the accountability measures are what I mean by transparent is we're eventually through the school year going to have a full-scale site-up statewide that lists for every district and every school all the measures I talked about of where they score or grade, depending on what you want to call it, in terms of things like math and reading and others, in all these different components, so that people will be able to see very easily, very accessible to parents, to other educators, but to employers and the public as a whole, both to hold schools accountable, and I think to applaud districts and schools that do well. But if you're the owner of we're talking about a company with some folks here earlier, Generac, whose founders have been great supporters of the Kern Foundation of Education Reform. Generac's a good example. They're growing tremendously in my state. One of their biggest challenges, they can't hire enough engineers. Well, you look at not just that, but even entry-level positions coming out of school. If employers see that the community that they're vested in isn't cutting it when it comes to math, they're going to demand some changes, and hopefully, on the optimistic side, that may even be the case where we free up some things in terms of certification requirements for teaching and other things. You may have some employers saying, we're going to free up somebody to come in and help the school with maybe one of our engineers coming in part-time to help teach in some of the math or science areas or other things like that. I think it opens up a great window of opportunity. I think you only get there if you have very transparent, very objective accountability system, and that's part of the key here. Well, no, we're just early on, so we hope to continue to report back. Any other questions? It's kind of like the other day I had a press conference on the drought, and I covered things so thoroughly, they didn't have any questions. I said, I'm going to hold all the rest of those reporters accountable to never ask me any more questions than any other press conference. They didn't buy that, but go ahead.
Hi, Governor Walker. Thanks for being here. My name is Nick Rodriguez. I'm with the U.S. Education Delivery Institute. I wanted to ask you about the higher education component of your reforms. I think one of the things a lot of us worry about in K-12 is thinking about alignment, particularly as regards new common standards, how faculty are being prepared, and how they're being prepared to prepare teachers for those, and then entry requirements as well.
Yeah, a couple things, particularly on the latter specifics. That was one of the things, particularly on our reading initiative, where we not only talked about changing and having a more robust and rigorous licensure exam requirement like Massachusetts has, but in particular, we're working with our University of Wisconsin system on saying our curriculum and our institutions have to change because they weren't up to those standards either. And so that's been part of the mix of trying to do that in a very specific sense. Beyond that, I tell you, not only in terms of aligning education standards in the schools of education and preparing, but one of the other exciting things, and eventually this might be something, a component we could explore in the K through 12 level. We just announced a couple weeks ago, for example, we're trying to do new innovative things. We announced the University of Wisconsin Flexible Degree Program, where it's similar to what the Western Governors University has done, but we said, why do something outside of our state? Why not take our UW system and try and do that? So we have a system where you can take, certainly we have over 150 courses online like most institutions do. We found there's more than, about a quarter of all of our citizens have some college class work, but they don't have a degree. And so we want to make it easier, particularly for adult learners, to tie into that. So we said if you've got time in the classroom, you've got time online, but if you've been out working for a while, we'll give you credit for that, but we want it to be rigorous because we don't want to just give you a degree just because you've spent time. You're going to test on it. So we'll test you, but we'll divide, in fact, we'll divide courses up into modules so that if you want to go into engineering and maybe you work there but you haven't got an engineering degree but you worked for a Generac, we can give you credit for the things you've learned as long as you test at that level, you know, you're up to the standard of that degree, and we'll mix it all together. And we'll even take stuff if you know, increasingly there's online courses, or not online, but you know, you can go to iTunes now and get courses. You can go over to MIT and here at Harvard and others. We'll give you credit at other institutions as long as you test that you're competent or proficient or higher in those areas, and we'll try and piece that together. The idea beyond just education students, but for all these other criteria, is trying to find ways to make it more accessible to get degrees in areas where we need them, and in many cases more affordable, because instead of having to pay for a full course, you pay for what you need and you pay enough to cover the test for the rest. Sure.
Hi, thank you for coming to here today. My name's Caitlin Donnelly. I work with Michael Barber at Pearson, and one of the things we heard earlier from our panel was Jonathan Schnur made the point that we need to build leaders at school and system level to be able to drive through change. And I was wondering what you thought about how the state of Wisconsin's been building up those leaders and how it feeds into your reform program.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I think we're going to build off. We've started on that, but one of the things that I'm interested in is pursuing, we were talking about this earlier, more freedom, more flexibility in our schools. And a good example would be not only for teachers, but even for principals in terms of certification and other requirements out there, having more flexibility there so that schools and districts can hire, not just based on a certificate, but give them some more flexibility, because obviously the vast majority of leaders in those areas are going to come out of traditional education backgrounds, but you potentially have many others who may have career changes or offer good management skills that don't necessarily have an education background, but who could be of great value and a great assistance. And again, for us, we want to give more freedom, more flexibility to our schools. With the changes we made in collective bargaining, that's a huge hurdle to go over. But now there's even some things within our Department of Public Instruction in terms of statutory certification requirements that we'd like to see, if not eliminated, at least altered, so there's more flexibility there. I'll give you a good example. When I was the Milwaukee County Executive, probably one of my best cabinet members, the person who headed up Health and Human Services, was a guy who never worked in Health and Human Services, but who was a great manager. And he'd gotten graduate work, worked in other areas, had great management skills. Well, he was great because people weren't turning to him as a practitioner. they were turning to him as someone who turned on specific issues to great practitioners, but he didn't get involved in that. He got involved in the successful management of that, and I think that could be of great value in our schools for many of our education leaders as well.
Over here.
Sure.
Governor, Daniel Woodring from Florida. We did a little reform in Florida over the years, and we actually did a fair amount of collective bargaining reform when Governor Bush was in.
Yeah.
One question I have for you is, we discovered that even when you give managers flexibility, in other words, we got rid of a lot of rules, we got rid of a lot of requirements, that they still didn't take advantage, i.e. they weren't necessarily keeping the best teachers, they weren't necessarily making those decisions even though they had the flexibility. What are you doing in Wisconsin to make sure that that flexibility is actually utilized?
That's a great point, and some of it was looking at Florida and some other states, but saying both incentive on the positive side in terms, I know some of the things that were done in Florida were actually even cash incentives, and those are things we're looking at because our school districts now have almost unlimited flexibility in doing things like that. But again, it goes back to the initial question and response is, I think it's got to be driven by accountability. That not just for the sake of saying, are they going to initiate a reform or not, but if the status quo isn't getting a school, for example, up to an acceptable level in terms of how they're being measured, ultimately that principal, as much as he or she might be reluctant to put new staff in or to try new things, there's going to be tremendous pressure from the rest of that school district and from that community to have that district, or to have that school, excuse me, make some dramatic changes. To me, I mentioned this before, but I don't know, have you seen the movie Moneyball? But to me, that's a good example of where I think great flexibility, driven by good data, can make a difference. You don't know the story, know what I'm talking about, but the story back all the way back to the Oakland A's of where they didn't have much of a payroll, but they had a successful franchise for a while because they made a change in terms of not just doing things the old way where scouts came in and eyed people up and said this is a good player for this, that, or whatever. They actually used data to drive what they needed and what they could afford for the dollar amounts that they had out there, and it produced a winning record, which today, years later, is replicated by just about every professional baseball team, as well as other sports franchises. That's what I'd like to see in our schools, is to say, yeah, there's going to be a lot of people who are reluctant to make change, but if the data shows the success, but you only know that if you have truly rigorous, transparent, and objective systems by which you can hold people accountable. And I just think that's where it's going to fall back. And that's where we're not just going to have them, but try and engage not only parents, which is obviously the first and foremost, most vested body of people in our state who have an interest in this, but I think, again, you look at employers in our state, civic leaders in our state, and others, there's a tremendous vested interest in there. And I think many of them get what, again, this report this morning pointed out very vividly. Many of them have been saying it for years. They just haven't had a quantitative way of pointing to that. This helps us do it. And I think the report helps us, not only in Wisconsin, I think the report helps us elsewhere to say, hey, look at this. The data's clear. We're not competing. We were joking before about the Vikings and the Gophers and the Badgers and that. As governors, we like to compete with sports teams, but we like to compete as well in business rankings, education rankings. You tie that together. It's why I mentioned yesterday the bond rating agencies were interested because they're interested in our economy. If we're doing things that tie that all together, there's going to be tremendous pressure out there, but you can't have pressure if everybody's in denial and nobody's talking about the facts. The more you put out an accountability system, the better off I think we're going to be.
So I'll take the opportunity to ask the last question.
Sure.
And then, so the last question I'd like to ask is, you've been advocating transparency. Do you believe the Common Core Standards is going to give us that transparency that we need as a nation?
My last sip. Well, it's one that probably could take a whole afternoon to talk about, but I mean, it's a balance. I mean, there's got to be some measure out there, whether or not that's the best way. I mean, a lot of these things I think we can we can build off of. I was mentioning earlier, No Child Left Behind, which I know there's a lot of folks who have questions about, but I applaud the President, Senator Kennedy, and others for at least having that debate. We've got to have a debate somewhere along the line about, what does it mean to have truly successful schools? For me, it's a little bit of a balancing act, not only on Common Core standards, but even on the No Child Left Behind, because as I mentioned, innately, I'm someone who very much believes in the 10th Amendment, and so I prefer things to be driven at the state level. On the other hand, again, we're competing not just as states, we're competing as a country. We're competing as regions, we're competing overall as a country, and whether it's the Common Core standards or not, there's got to be some way that we take this on as an economic as well as a moral imperative. And that's why, again, I think sessions like this and even the report you put out helps. Because in our state, it affirms the work we've done. In other states, maybe it's just a kick in the tail to the leaders to say, if America is going to compete, states that aren't achieving anywhere near some of those top states got to do something. We have to do something. And the interesting thing is it's one of those rare issues that really isn't Republican or Democrat. It's just fact. It's just plain up fact. And so, in fact, when we looked at our reforms, one of the interesting things, we looked at Florida, but we looked at Massachusetts, looked at Delaware, looked at other states. There isn't necessarily a clear line when it comes to education reform that directly comes from one party to the other. It comes from risk takers. People are willing to admit that there's a problem and they're willing to take the risk to take that on because it's a lot easier. I'm sure even in the next few years, it'll be interesting as we try and raise our standards in Wisconsin. Somebody will say, well, Governor, your numbers are far less than before you started. Well, it's because we changed the measurement, made them more rigorous. It's kind of like I've got a surgeon I know who takes the worst cancer patients out there, so he has a higher mortality rate than others. It's because he's the surgeon who takes people that nobody else thinks can live and somehow creates miracles and creates people who can live. Well, if you just looked at his mortality rate, you'd think he's an awful surgeon. Well, we've got to be willing to take that risk and explain and be transparent enough to say, we're not cutting it, we got to figure out a way to do it. We're willing to take the risk to demand higher standards. And certainly it starts with a national debate, but I think ultimately it goes right down to the school and the classroom, and that's where the standards, the rubber hits the road. So, thanks.
Well, thank you all, and we'll start the next session in about 5 minutes. So why don't we call the next panel up.